My name is Ellen Goldsmith, and for as long as I can remember, I've been very good at planning things. Spreadsheets for vacations, color-coded chore charts, an Excel that maps out the exact timeline from say yes to say I do. Mark Reynolds, my fiancé, my co-conspirator on IKEA furniture, proposed on a rainy November evening under the pretense of needing directions. And because I run toward projects like a moth to a lampshade, the wedding became the next big, delicious thing to organize. We set a date 12 months out, booked a small historic hall that smells faintly of lemon oil and old wood, and invited 70 of the people who matter most to us. I grew up in a house where money was a background hum, present but never flashy. My mother, Ellen Goldsmith, has always been the practical one. Sensible shoes, sensible advice, sensible investment in conservative bond funds. When the topic of a wedding fund came up, Mom and I had the talk everyone seems to have now. Who pays what? Who will help? Will Aunt Lorraine contribute a bouquet's worth of casseroles? Mom said she'd help. She didn't promise extravagance, but she promised enough to make the hall deposit and cover a few other big-ticket items. I breathed a little easier and shifted some items from must-have to maybe, because that promise made our budget real. I had also been saving the way you save for a trip, small, steady deposits into an account I labeled, somewhat obnoxiously, Wedding Do Not Touch. That account was my quiet pride, a tangible thing everyone could see when I pulled up the balance and calculated the number of embroidered napkins we could afford. The day the rug was pulled out from under me feels like it happened in slow motion. It was a Thursday. Mom called. No preamble, no small talk, just the sound of a phone being forced into seriousness. "Ellen," she said, and I heard the teeth in the word. "I've been thinking, I won't be funding this circus." Those 5 words landed like a dropped glass. I laughed first, like a reflex. "What circus?" I asked, because the human brain sometimes reaches for humor to stave off the sting. "The wedding," she replied. "All of it. I'm not paying for something I didn't sign up for. Weddings change people, Ellen. I won't be funding this circus." I felt every planned napkin fold, every seating chart, every conversation about bridesmaid dresses go blurry at the edges. There was a hollow, practical panic. You can't reorder invitations overnight if half your budget disappears. But underneath that was a younger, more brittle hurt. The sharp sting of being told my joy is frivolous by the person whose approval had been a North Star for as long as I can remember. I asked her why. She hemmed and hawed. Something about being put upon, about finances not being what she expected, but refused to go where I needed her to go. I could hear the distance in her words, the finality. We ended the call with her saying she'd be in touch, and me holding the phone as if it were suddenly fragile. Mark was home from work when I told him, and I saw his face rearrange the way it does when he's trying to make arithmetic into comfort. He sat down, took my hands, and said simply, "We'll figure it out. I'll take care of it." He meant it. There was no grandstanding, no heroics. The next day, he began reworking his budget, calling vendors, and quietly transferring funds. He didn't make a speech about loyalty. He made a spreadsheet that balanced out like a patient, stubborn apology. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt split into halves. One part grateful for Mark's steadiness, one part incandescent with the knowledge that the person who promised to help had withdrawn not only funding, but faith in me. I tried to be practical. There are worse things than planning your wedding without a parent's contribution, but practical is not an antidote for the rawness of a promise broken. That night, I lay awake thinking about deposits and linens and the small, particular indignities of adult betrayal. I kept replaying my mother's voice, Circus, and wondering what had changed between the woman who taught me how to sew a button and the woman who couldn't say she'd be there for me in a way that mattered. Mark slept like he has always slept, peaceful, as if his brain files problems into boxes and locks them away until morning. I watched him and felt a complicated warmth. He had stepped up when the person I expected to step up had turned away. It should have been simple gratitude, but it wasn't. It was gratitude tangled with a very human question. Why had my mom walked away so easily, and what else had she walked away from without telling me? The next morning, I did the thing you tell yourself you'll never do. I went to the bank, not because the math didn't add up, but because my stomach kept whispering that it wouldn't. I sat at a plastic chair under fluorescent lights and asked for a printout of every transaction on the account labeled wedding, do not touch. The woman at the counter, her name was Denise, and she had the charity of someone who has listened to 30 people complain before lunch, tapped keys, handed me envelopes, and asked if I wanted anything else. I said no, folded the statements under my arm like a life preserver, and left feeling both ridiculous and ferocious. Back at the apartment, Mark made coffee while I spread the paper across the kitchen table. The statements were neat, each line a tiny, polite betrayal. Small withdrawals at first, $200 here, $350 there, labeled things I would have ignored. Family loan, help, MG, emergency. The numbers added up, though. The pattern did something to my ribs. A slow, methodical extraction every few weeks, each transfer curving toward a name I recognized. Blue Heron Cafe. That was my sister Rachel's place, the tiny restaurant on Elm Street with the chalkboard specials and the wavering string lights. Rachel, the one who always looked like she'd been late to everything but somehow made it work. My knees went weak. I replayed every conversation with Marion in a different light. The help she'd said she was giving Rachel, the temporary loan she'd promised would be repaid, the way she'd brushed off my question about the wedding with that sharp circus remark. None of it had felt like theft in the moment. It had felt absurdly like being roped into the adult version of a soap opera where everyone thinks they're doing the right thing. She moved my money to Rachel's business account. I said finally, because saying it aloud is how you stop your head from inventing worse scenarios. Mark read one of the lines over my shoulder and then the memo at the top that made it official. An ACH transfer, authorized by Ellen Goldsmith, labeled plainly, as if whoever typed it had worried about being clever. Emergency infusion, the memo read, dated 3 months ago. Did you ever give her access? He asked. I had, in a way that used to feel safe. When Aunt Lorraine had been in the hospital 2 years back, Marion had helped me manage medical paperwork, pay bills, and set up automatic transfers. At some point, we'd set up the Wedding Do Not Touch account with Marion as an authorized user, so she could help move payments around on my behalf while I juggled work and planning. It had been practical, a little silly, a little intimate. I had trusted her like you trust the person who taught you how to sew a button back on, without thinking about the needle. She never asked me, I said. There were no calls, no texts, just withdrawals. The coffee had gone cold. My hands found the edge of the paper until the tips of my fingers were white. I felt like a character in a story where every houseplant suddenly turned out to be a secret agent for the plot. Betrayal is a funny thing. Sometimes it hits like a slap, sometimes like a slow leak. This was the slow leak, every incremental withdrawal, a tiny betrayal stitched into months of my life. I called Rachel. Her voice was the same alto it always was, warm and surprised. Ellen, Did Mom tell you she was moving money into Blue Heron? I asked, trying to keep my voice flat. A pause. Then, what? No, she didn't. She gave me a couple of checks early on when I was short on payroll, but I thought those were from her personal account. I didn't know they'd come from your account. Ellen, I would never. There was a tremor in Rachel's voice that felt real enough. She is not the sharpest tool in the shed. Her focus is a different muscle, more improvisation, less ledger. She ran the restaurant with a chef's temperament, passionate, scattershot, devoted. I believed her, even as the anger kept pounding under my skin. I need to see the bank records, I said. I need to know how much. She promised she would, though I could hear the gears turning, Rachel trying to reconcile reality with guilt. She kept saying, I'm so sorry, before I had the courage to finish the call. That sorry felt like a bandage over something that needed stitches. My fury wasn't cinematic. It was not a cartoon villain monologue. It was practical and furious in a way that made me want to count, to document, to make sure what could be proven could be undone. I made photographs of the statements, saved PDFs, and started a list. Dates, amounts, memo lines, the names attached. Mark helped, quietly, perfectly, a human calculator who translates emotion into boxes. He set up a folder. Evidence. The word felt dramatic, which made me feel slightly guilty, like someone who'd named a houseplant Evidence to feel less alone. Between anger and paperwork, grief sat there like a heavy, muffled clock. It wasn't just the loss of money. It was the loss of a particular myth I'd had about my family, that when push came to shove, the people who raised me would be the ones standing in the doorway holding umbrellas. Instead, my savings, the clumsy, earnest nest I'd built with my own paychecks, had been repurposed without my consent, used like an IOU from my life. The more practical part of me began to arrange itself around the problem. We would call a lawyer, Mark said. We would confront Marion, I added, and not in the brittle way I'd argued the week before, but with that list of dates and transfers spread out like evidence on a table. We would ask questions, and if we didn't get honest answers, we'd do the thing adult people do when words fail: go to court. Before any of that happened, I went to Blue Heron, because there are places that make betrayal feel more real, and Rachel's place did. The low murmur of plates, the familiar clang of spoons. Rachel was behind the counter, face flushed, wiping down the espresso machine like someone trying to polish away a mistake. I sat across from her and watched the restaurant breathe, and felt, more sharply than anything, that the line between helping and taking had been blurred by the person who should have known better. I had not yet spoken to Marion since uncovering the transfers. The thought of calling her made my mouth dry. I folded the statements back into an envelope and breathed through my anger, because fury without a plan is only noise. And I had a wedding to plan and a life I refused to let become a ledger of other people's mistakes. But I also knew I was no longer just wounded. I was awake. The game had changed. Going to court felt like showing up for a fight you've been rehearsing in your head for months, and realizing you're finally allowed to say the lines out loud. I printed everything twice, highlighted every transfer until the paper looked like a map of my anger, and folded the stack into a manila folder labeled evidence, like a person who wants the world to know she has her receipts. My lawyer, Naomi Chen, wore decisive glasses and the kind of calm that is secretly terrifying to opposing counsel. Mark came with me. No suit, just that patient look he gets when he's holding on to someone while the world does something loud. The courtroom was small, institutional scented, with a judge who had been doing this job long enough to clip the theatrics off early. Marion sat on the other side with an attorney who kept using the word regretful, like a talisman. Rachel came too, face a little too pale, folding and unfolding a tissue like she was practicing steadiness. I felt ridiculous for wanting her there, and natural for wanting proof. Rachel's presence was a small human check against the abstract numbers in the bank statements. Naomi was surgical. She walked the judge through the account setup, the authorized user status, the memo lines, emergency infusion, help, MG, and then she did the thing lawyers do that makes people believe in paperwork. She read the dates aloud. The numbers, read in a courtroom, make a cadence that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with betrayal. The judge's eyebrows moved once, measured, and then flattened into a face that says, "This is not complicated." Marion's defense was a mixture of poor bookkeeping and good intentions. She had meant to help Rachel, she said. She was worried about payroll. It was a family thing. She had not intended to violate Ellen's trust. Sorry, regretful. Words that felt thin when stacked against a ledger. Naomi did not demonize Marion. She framed the argument like this: authorization is not permission to reassign someone's savings without their knowledge. Consent matters. In the end, the law agreed. The ruling was what I could have predicted on paper, but not in my chest. The court ordered Marion to repay the full amount she had transferred from my wedding do not touch account, plus interest and court fees. The judge set a repayment schedule and, in a move that made the room exhale, approved a clause I'd insisted on during settlement talks. The repayments would be made into a court-supervised escrow account, earmarked for two things. First, restitution to me for the stolen savings. Second, a business recovery fund for Blue Heron to cover payroll shortfalls and improvements, administered by a small advisory committee including Rachel and myself. That clause was the quiet, clever part of my revenge. Marion had siphoned money to help Rachel without asking me. Now she had to pay it back, but under terms that meant she had to face the consequence publicly and make amends where the damage had been done. It forced accountability and repair. It also removed the easy moral theater. She couldn't hide behind "I was helping my daughter," because helping now required a transparent, verifiable action. Hers, not mine. Rachel testified. She was honest in a way that hurt and healed at the same time. "I didn't know the money came from Ellen," she said, voice small but steady. "If I'd known." She stopped and wiped her face. "I'm so sorry, Ellen. I should have asked more questions." Her apology wasn't a dramatic crescendo. It was the kind of apology that sounds like a person trying to learn a new language. Clumsy, earnest, and real. After court, Rachel hugged me like someone who wanted to mend what she had accidentally unstitched. She wasn't the mastermind. She was a person who had accepted help and not dug through its pockets. I accepted her hug because grief and forgiveness can be strange roommates. You make them share a couch until the house feels right again. Marion, when her turn came, looked older. Not just in years, she looked smaller, as if the moral accounting had turned into a physical thing you could see. Her attorney offered the standard "I regret this" script. But then, unscripted, Marion stood and said, "Ellen, I'm sorry. I took something of yours without asking. I thought I was helping Rachel, and I did it with my hands, not my head. I was wrong." The words came out rough. She did not beg. She did not try to justify. For once, she met the ledger with a face. There was no cinematic gavel-bang vengeance. The courtroom's version of revenge was steadier. The law required restitution and transparency, and the restitution would be visible. Checks written, deposits made, records kept. It was the kind of revenge that prefers balance sheets to melodrama, which suited me. My anger wanted numbers as well as words. Mark squeezed my hand when Marion left the room. "You did the adult thing," he said, which was an understatement of heroic proportions. He didn't mean adult as a compliment about paperwork. He meant it as recognition that I had turned a private wound into public repair without becoming someone I didn't want to be. I leaned into him and let the tremor go out of my shoulders like a sigh you didn't know you were holding. On the courthouse steps, photographers were nowhere. This was not the kind of story that sells. The victory felt small and enormous at once. Small because it was just numbers on paper. Enormous because those numbers meant my nest egg wasn't gone, and because the court had forced an outcome that prioritized repair. Rachel promised to match part of the recovery fund with a series of community dinners and a reworked payroll plan. Marion agreed to the repayment schedule, and under Naomi's practical insistence, to financial counseling so this wouldn't be a repeat offense. I left the courthouse with my folder lighter, as if the evidence had done the job it was meant to, turned suspicion into fact, then into consequence. There was no gloating, only a slow, steady satisfaction. Revenge had been achieved not with spectacle, but with structure. A court order, a repayment plan, a trust that would keep an eye on how restitution was spent. It was cleaner than I'd imagined, quieter than I'd dreamed, and perhaps more permanent. That night, drowsy on the couch, Mark made me tea and sat with me like a buoy. I thought about the wedding again, but differently. Less like a ghost that had been snatched away, more like a project that had weathered a storm. Revenge had been served, justified, proportionate, practical, and alongside it, a path for Rachel to rebuild without the theater of scandal. It wasn't perfect. Nothing is. But it felt, finally, like the kind of justice that lets people get back to being complicated and human, rather than villains in a morality play. After the courthouse dust settled, life didn't flip like a light switch. It rearranged itself, quietly, like furniture after a small earthquake. Same pieces, new angles. Blue Heron began to breathe easier. Rachel started hosting those community dinners she'd promised. Themed nights where neighbors brought pies and local musicians played on a borrowed stool. People who'd only ever driven past the chalkboard specials started parking and staying. A blogger named Mateo from the local indie paper wrote one of those rapturous columns that made a place suddenly feel like an insider secret. Reservations filled up, then overflowed. Rachel hired a real sous chef, Maya, who could turn 2 potatoes and an expired jar of capers into something people would line up for. Payroll stabilized. The recovery fund we agreed on helped pay past due invoices and supply new, sturdier shelving so the kitchen stopped looking like a collage of good intentions. Watching Rachel stand at the pass on a busy Friday, cheeks flushed with the same stubborn joy she'd always worn like an apron, felt like a small miracle I hadn't allowed myself to hope for. She'd learned, bumpy as it was, to ask where help came from and to keep better track of what she accepted. She apologized to me in ways that didn't require spotlight drama. She fixed my favorite dessert on a slow night and left a single spoon on my table with a note that said, simply, "For Ellen, who makes me try harder." That spoon was a better apology than any courtroom flourish. Marion's contrition was quieter and steadier than I'd imagined. She started attending the financial counseling Naomi insisted on. What began as a requirement grew into something like repentance. She came into Blue Heron one afternoon, awkward and tentative, and asked if she could help fold napkins. Rachel handed her a stack and a damp rag without blinking. It was humbling to watch. The woman who had once taught me to sew buttons now learning how to take inventory and cut costs. Marion wrote the checks the court ordered. She sat through one of Rachel's community dinners, and when the meal was done and the lights were dimmer and the customers had spilled into the street like satisfied moths, she found me in the doorway and said, "Ellen, I am sorry. I am so sorry." There are ways to say sorry that demand immediate absolution, and ways to say sorry that ask for work. Marion's apology was the latter. She didn't expect a magic eraser. She expected to show up. I accepted the apology because it was honest, and because revenge had never been the point I wanted to stand on forever. The restitution ordered by the court had returned what was mine. Marion's presence and work were the rest stitching. Mark and I went back to planning, but with different eyes. The spreadsheets returned, yes. Some habits don't die. But they had different columns now. What matters? What's meaningful? And a small, stubborn line called fun. We decided to cut the guest list where it made sense, not because of money, but because intimacy matters more than grandeur. We booked the same lemon oil hall and added a string of warm white lights Rachel swore made photos look like nostalgia. Mark made another budget, and then, when I began to tighten my jaw over details, he would joke in that precise, loving way that roped me back into the present. Napkins happen. Love. The marriage is the furniture you build after the party. I sent my mother an RSVP. It wasn't performative. I didn't write it in capitals or underline anything. The card read, "Ellen Goldsmith, accepting with gratitude." Beneath my name, I wrote a single sentence. "You are welcome." It was both an invitation and a boundary. I mailed it on a Wednesday, the kind of day that smells like deli coffee and second chances. On the day of the wedding, Mark and I stood in that lemon-scented hall and watched friends and family take their places. There was laughter and clumsy dancing. A kid spilled juice and was promptly forgiven. My mother arrived, not in a dramatic scene-stealing rush, but in shoes that made small, polite sounds on the floor. She hugged me. It was brief and careful, the kind of hug that keeps room for both forgiveness and memory. Rachel sat near the front, cheeks still the color of someone who cooks for a living, and when she caught my eye, she raised her glass the way cooks do, silent, full of fuel and warmth. There was no cinematic unburdening, no grand speech that tied the entire tragedy into a single tidy moral. There was, instead, a simple sequence of things, vows said in low voices, Mark's hand warm and steady over mine, the music starting at the exact time our DJ promised it would. When I looked over to the head table, Marion was there, present, not perfect. She laughed at the right moments and cried at the right ones. She didn't try to make up for months in a single breath. She listened to our toasts without interrupting. At one point, she slipped me a folded napkin with neat stitches at the corner. Nostalgia, a skill she'd taught me as a child. And in that small act, I felt the old and new versions of our family fold into something that might, given time, hold. After the cake, when the party quieted down and the hall smelled like lemon oil again, but softer, I sat for a minute with Mark looking at the little chaos we'd created and survived. I thought about justice, how sometimes it looks like numbers on paper and other times like people showing up to do the slow work. I thought about revenge, how mine had been a ledger more than a spectacle, a repair more than a punchline. I felt relieved, not because everything was fixed. Relationships are not finished projects, but because the worst of the theft had been undone, and because the people involved had been asked to be accountable in ways that made change possible. We left that night sticky with cake and happy in the precise, quiet way of people who have done the right thing by their own hearts. Marion walked us to the car and whispered, "Thank you for the invitation." I said, "Thank you for showing up." It was as much a promise as anything else, that we had moved past the worst of it and were willing to keep rebuilding with honesty. The blue heron sign still hangs, slightly weathered, but more full than it had been. Rachel texts me sometimes pictures of a new dish she's trying. Marion asks for bookkeeping tips, like a student, not a judge. Mark and I keep making lists, folding napkins, and occasionally arguing about final playlist songs with the ferocity of two people who care deeply about what will be remembered. If anything about this story has a moral, it is a small one. People can fail you. Trust can be misused. But restitution, real restitution, changes the shape of what comes next. I mailed my RSVP, and the party happened. That was enough.